Excellent. So, my name's Justin Walker, and I am a senior environment artist currently working at EA Sports. If you would like to follow me on ArtStation, you can with the above link. I have worked in the games industry, film industry, ArchViz industry, and the automotive industry on projects such as Killzone and Guardians of the Galaxy. I've worked as an environment artist, modeler, lighter, material artist, and also a vehicle artist. So here is a shot from the movie Guardians of the Galaxy that I worked on. My job was modeling TD, and I worked on the background buildings for Xandar City. These were created kit bashing buildings that we made together. Our reference was Singapore, so we basically created. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor,
Yeah,
Ben?
yeah,
Yeah. So as you can see in this building in the background, you can see just like loads of little buildings just sort of wedged into each other to make these sort of sci-fi looking buildings. And here is an image from when I worked in ArchViz. This was all rendered in Unreal. It's fairly old now, maybe 5-6 years ago in Unreal 4, and just aiming to try and get sort of push that photorealism really. And here's another one from that. Also in my free time, I like to model vehicles, and these are a couple of the vehicles I made which helped me get my first job as a professional vehicle artist. And here is the scene, Robot Beach Trash. And this is what we're going to talk to you about today. So Robot Beach Trash is a collaboration I worked on with the supremely talented Ben Keeling. We wanted to create a diorama of a robot's home on a beach with the theme of recycling and clean energy. We also wanted to ensure that it has a focus on animation. It was important to us that the piece had character, charm, and was fun to look at. My main focus for this project was asset creation. My background sort of focused more towards modeling and texturing, so assets was where I sort of spent most of my time on this project. I worked on the optical machine, the baling machine, conveyor, power elements, and the charging station. And here is a breakdown of some of those assets that I worked on. So today I'm going to run through with you my approach for creating the baler and the optical machine. I wanted to give you an overview on creating a style guide, reference gathering, high and low poly setup, texturing, and a few tips for increasing realism in your assets. So with that, let's get started. So the first thing that we decided to do for this project, as it was a collaboration, was we wanted to create a art bible. And the reason we created the art bible was to decide on an art style, so we were both in correlation with each other. This was particularly important for consistency within this collaboration. So the big thing that helped us along the way were these keywords that we had to keep reminding ourselves. So cinematic, animated, fun, exciting, vibrant, exaggerated realism, and cute. So we constantly went back to these keywords to make sure we didn't drift off the brief, which we did at times, and this was just a really good resource for coming back and keeping everything on track. So we had quite an extensive art bible here. I won't go through all of it, but just to show you guys the importance of sort of having all this information in one place, and then you're both sort of working towards a common goal. So as I said, the first thing was to create the style guide. So we wanted to make sure we were hitting on these keywords. So they were going to be stylized assets. We were going to use large bevels, exaggerated features, vibrant colors, rounded edges, and minimal hard edges. Now, this was quite challenging for me because my background was mainly photorealism and working in film. So Ben sort of guided me quite a lot in making sure that we sort of reached these targets and created this character, and things were like realistic but had that sort of nice, fun, stylized feel to them. So our core reference for this was Fallout 4 and Wolfenstein. And as you can see here, we've got these lovely assets here, vibrant colors. They're all looking like realistic assets in terms of their texturing, but they've got these really fun sort of big rounded shapes to them. So these really were key for creating a lot of the assets that we made. So the first thing I had to do was work out what I was going to make for this project, and I knew that the theme for this project was going to be recycling. So I wanted to figure out what the recycling process was in order to make these believable recycling machines. So the process is essentially an infeed where all of the trash gets sucked in, and then this trash is then sorted, and then it is separated from useful objects to trash, and then it's baled up. So as you can see here, we've got the orange infeed pipe. We have our optical machine, which is essentially our sorting machine, and then this then feeds down into a conveyor belt into the baling machine. Down the conveyor, then the robot will basically pick these up, take them to the back, and then these will be shipped off the island. And the idea is that we have multiple islands like this scattered around, and it's just like a big cleanup operation. And here's a couple more shots of these machines that I made. So the first thing to do, photo reference. So search for some photo reference for optical sorting machines, and found out I had these nice mechanical arms inside, had viewing windows, had little computer screens. Was also sort of trying to gather some inspiration for color reference as well. So we, as you can see, we sort of carried on the blue, black and yellow theme throughout. And then we've got the baling machine. So as you can see here, we've got something that's fairly close to what we made in the end, but we've kind of exaggerated all of those things, softened everything up and made it have lots of more character. And as you can see, we've got this mechanical press, which we did intend to animate, but due to time constraints, we didn't actually end up doing that. And then I just focused in on some of the finer details. So we had these nice hydraulic pumps, these hydraulic arms, some nice details in here, and these connectors. And then just a little bit of reference on conveyors and on the little readout screens. And the idea was that we were going to try and reuse as much of this as possible. So I think you'll find these are on both machines. Okay. So now we've talked about... Hello?
Hello. You have a question if you wanted to check. If you
Of
had
course.
Yeah. So yeah, in the workshop chat, if you wanted to check
Okay, 1 sec. Let's have a look. How would you differentiate exaggerated realism from stylized in this project? So the exaggerated realism is more that, like, for example, in the Fallout, we've got like these big, round, soft shapes. So it's based on realism. This is my interpretation of it. But we've basically just got rid of all these hard edges. And if I just go back to my... So here we just got like much bigger rounded shapes here, chunked everything up. So basically when you do photoreal, you might find that you have a lot of these really sort of fine micro details. So one of the things in mine and Ben's feedback sessions is like chunk up all these pipes, make these rib sections wider, make these edges rounder. So it's, like I said, it's realism, but it's just exaggerating all of those elements so you don't get those details sort of lost. So let's jump over to Maya, and I'm now going to talk about the modeling process and the setup. So jumping over to the baling machine. So it's a pretty standard setup here if you're high and low poly. So basically I have my high poly, which has my material IDs set up. I have just come around here. I've made sure when setting up my material IDs that I have contrasting colors for things like vents, because I know these are going to be baked to a plane eventually. So in order to get a nice mask in Substance Painter, we need to make sure those colors are very contrasty. And I've separated everything and name matched, ready for the bakers in Substance. So basically anything that I think is going to give me issues baking the normal map, I've separated out so we get a nice clean normal map. Tend to sort of overkill this a little bit so I can try and get that perfect normal map and not have to do too much cleanup in Photoshop. So that's my high and low poly. And what I also like to do is I like to create a separate mesh for my AO. So essentially what I'll be doing is I'll be importing this into Substance Painter, this low poly. So this has all my nice UVs, all mapped nicely from 0 to 1. And then what I will then do is I will hook up the high poly in the bakers, bake my normal map. Once my normal map is baked, then I will go in and I will import my low poly AO mesh. And the reason I do an AO mesh separately is because I know some of these elements are going to animate. So it's just a really quick way I find of just getting that nice clean AO bake without having to go into Photoshop too much. And also you can see here, if I go onto my low poly on these pipes are just laid out as a strip. So yeah, by doing that an extra AO mesh, we can sort of alleviate having to clean that up. And then what also I have my final export mesh. So this is my export mesh. So it's optimized. I've also put in a few extra edge loops because one of the things I wanted to talk about was how to sort of get better realism in your assets. When I worked in film, one of the big things that came up was that, especially CG assets, you can make things just very, very straight. And then when you render those, you can really see that these assets aren't real because real life things have all these little knocks and dents and bends and things in them. So I add these extra edge loops in here. So all these pipes are broken up. These edges are broken up. These edges are broken up. Now, this is my game export mesh. So what you can do is you can import this into Substance right at the end, but just whatever you do, don't bake on this mesh because this is just purely just my final export mesh. So another thing, just for while we're touching on realism, is it's important to have all these nice little connectors where things join into each other. So every time you have a piece of geometry extruding, don't just extrude it straight from this mesh. Like add these little extra sort of lips and these little connection points. And again, around here, just little connection points. Because when you have like a flat piece of geometry intersecting a flat piece of geometry, sometimes it just doesn't look quite real. Again, we've got all these little trims here just to bed it all in. So that's what I wanted to talk about for the modeling process. And now let's jump over to Painter. And what I'll do is I'll talk about some texturing methods that I've used for this. Let's just do a quick chat of the questions. So we have a question, is the style guide available anywhere publicly? Would love to take a look at it though. It's not. I will have a chat with Ben and maybe we can put together sort of like a template of just things that you can put in it and provide an example. I'm sure it won't be too much of a problem. Did you consider a mid-poly mesh decal workflow? Yes, I do tend to do that. I tend to have my bake mesh a lot higher poly in most cases because obviously baking things like, especially like rounded surfaces, it's good to have those few extra edge loops that you won't necessarily use in game. So yeah, it's a good question. And yes, the answer is yes, I do. So now over to Painter. So one of the things that I wanted to focus on quite a lot of this is obviously our style guide was to have character and sort of cuteness. So I wanted to make out like the robot has been interacting with this machine. He's on this island on his own. He might get a bit bored. He wants to personalize things. So he's found these stickers and he's just stuck them over this machine. And it just gives you that sense that something has been interacting with this, adds that visual interest and that believability that you can, you're getting all that nice storytelling in. So I have another example of visual storytelling here, which I'll quickly show you. So in here, this is an asset I made a long time ago, and it was just like a boring, mundane post box. I think it was for an art test I did somewhere. And I wanted to just create a story that this post box had kind of been, interacted with by people. People had come and stood next to it for like their lunch breaks. They'd leaned up against it. They'd had a cigarette. They'd had a coffee. So you can see like cigarette butts down here. You can see the little cigarette stubs. Got your coffee cups and your spills. And then all these like interaction points here where the letters have gone in, where the handles have been constantly used and opened. So just think about that story, like how your object is interacting with the world, and it paints a picture so you can get that really nice sort of character into it. So I'm just going to go through a couple of tools and techniques. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was how I created the alphas for these visual storytelling elements. There's two methods I used. The first one was I just used a standard paintbrush, and then I had my alphas here. So basically I've got my little cookie alpha. If you double click that, you should find that loads up into the alpha channel automatic. And then you can just choose your map. So I can just drag in my base color, and then I can essentially just start to paint in theory. I need to create a layer, so just create a layer first, and then I can start to paint into here. And this is just really good for just this particular instance where I just wanted to paint like a trail of cookies rather than individually placing them. I can just really quickly go in. And one thing to note is that whilst this method is quite good for painting trails of things, it's not so good for tweaking things after. So it's quite important that if you want to have height information, make sure that height slider is not on 0, because if it is, there's nothing you can do to bring that back once you've painted, and you will just have to paint again. So what I like to do is just give it like quite a generous height value, and then what we can then is we can just literally just come in here, set our layer to height, and then we can just blend that in and out, change our normal map. Okay, so that's how we did the cookies. And another way of just placing decals is by literally, you can just drag them into the viewport. So choose base color. And then what we can do now is we can just literally scale these. And we can obviously add our channels as well. So if I wanted to add a height channel, what I like to do is just add the same texture. And then I can just tweak the height values and get like a nice clean height map on that. And then again, we can go in and just tweak that. And the great thing about doing this way is you have that flexibility where you can just literally go in and say, right, I want another texture, and just swap that out. So this is really nice. So there's just a couple of different methods you can use. And then obviously what we'd do is we'd go in and put in our levels, bring this value down because it's a bit bright at the moment. We could put our grunge maps in and everything like that, make it all nice. So that was how we did the decals. So another thing I wanted to speak with you about was how to create rust. So on here, we've got two different methods of doing rust. So we've got the nice procedural edge rust here, which are just basically done with generators. So I have in here just our standard sort of rusty edges. And this is just like a mask editor generator, and just played around with our values till we get something quite nice. But that's all like your generic rust. So then we've obviously got our hero rust, which is these elements here. So the way I did this is I have two layers. So I have my base rust layer, and then I have a mask. So what I did for the mask is I downloaded this alpha pack here. So this was a really nice alpha pack, super cheap. And I use this extensively for just doing the hero rust. So you can get that on ArtStation. And if I just go into my alphas. Okay, so the big ones that I used is, let's just go in here. And then we can just literally go in here and just start adding our rust to the edges, which is really nice. So that's a super easy way. And then obviously you also have control over your height map separately. So what I do is I have an anchor point here, and this is linked to my height map. So that's linked up in the fill. And then what that allows me to do is I can just play around with my height on here, which is quite nice. So that is how I did the rust and the decals. So then the final thing I wanted to talk to you about was PBR values, in particular sort of base color values for blacks, whites, and metals. So especially when working on a collab project, you want to make sure there's consistency throughout all of your assets. I think me and Ben made like 20 odd assets, and we were constantly checking in on Unreal to make sure they were all balanced and working well together. So the first thing to take note is we have a PBR validate node in here, which is super useful for checking these values. You will notice that there are red areas for the vents, and this is normal because we're using absolute black values just to show that there's a hole there. So ignore the vents for now. And let's just have a look at these. So first I wanted to talk to you about white values. No, I'll talk to you about black values. So here we have an example of full black, and this is very bad. If you look in the validate node, we have our layer set to 50 sRGB. This is for our base colors, non-metals, and then we have our metal reflectance range, which is 70 to 100%. So what this is basically saying is for blacks, this is basically working in RGB color space, but substance works in linear. So what I'll do is I'll hopefully get the conversions right. Ben, let me know if I don't. And so the blacks, as you can see here, we've got 100% black, and this is really bad. So what we want to do is, based on this PBR validate node, we want to make sure that our blacks are no darker than about 80% black, which is 0.2 in linear space. So the reasons for this is, although this looks a little bit counterintuitive and this looks quite light for a black, what you can do is, if you go into your display settings and look what this will actually look like in an editor, if we go into our color profile and load our UE4, you can see this looks pretty good for a black. And if I was to go back in here and bring this down to complete black, this just looks way too dark. So you need to make sure that your black values aren't absolute black, with the exception of, like I said, the vents. So this is like a balanced black. And let's turn this off for a second. And then likewise with the whites. Oh, sorry, let me just show you what these blacks. So when we have the full black, if I turn on the validate node, you can see this is red at full black. And as we dial this up, once we get up to about 0.2, then you can see that's all green and good. That's basically what that validate node is looking for. So let's just turn that off. And then likewise for the whites. So with the whites, full white is this, which when we turn back on our color profile, that just looks crazy bright. So if we dial that down, and what we're looking for is, let me just check my chart. So a maximum of 90 to 95% value. So what we've got here is, I like to put my whites at about 0.85. And I just think this gives like a really nice feel, and you don't normally get sort of too many areas blown out. It looks quite solid. And you can go up to 9.5, but I tend to like to have it a little bit below that. But 9.5 is also acceptable. So you can see on here, just bring this profile down. You can see 9.5 is still acceptable.
Just a comment, Justin.
Hello.
So also worth noting that some things that go super bright, a good example is snow. So if you have snow in your scene, that's like a good exception, because snow is really like one of the brightest things. So yeah, if you wanted, but obviously if you went to full bright, things just kind of clip out and they're way too bright. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I used to find that just a lot of things used to burn out in direct sunlight. So it's nice just to get that down. Thanks, Ben. Cheers. Yeah, so finally, what we've got to take note of is metals. And here's just a quick demonstration I've got for metals. So most metals, not all, require quite a counterintuitively bright base color. And sometimes things can look a bit strange in substance having them that bright. But I've found that once you get things over into Unreal and in different lighting scenarios, if you don't get these metal base color values correct, then things are just going to look really weird, especially in shadows. So what you are aiming for here is, if you look at your PBR node, it's 70 to 100%. So if we go down to this, so this is just an example of pure. This is basically my 70%. So this is basically as dark as you're going to want to go for most metals, with the exceptions of some. And if you go lower than that, then if we turn on our PBR validator, then this is going to go red. So this was something I had struggled with, and I'd done loads of textures and materials, and Ben basically said to me, this is something you need to pay attention to, and didn't understand fully why until, like I said, you're in a scene where you have lots of metal in shadows, and it really does make a big difference having these values correct. So while we're talking about, and obviously this is a pure metal we've got here, so what you want to do is obviously have all your nice color variation in here, and your grime and your dirt. So you just need to make sure that when you're adding the grime and dirt and variation, you're not pushing those values back over or under the threshold of 70%. So that's looking pretty good. And while we're on the subjects of metals, it's also worth noting that the metal mask I normally like to keep at a solid 100% white if it's a metal. There are some exceptions to the rule, but generally what I would do is avoid putting sort of like fine dirt and grime in the base color and only really use it as a mask. So if you had sort of thick mud over metal, then what you would then do is have your mask, which would just be a black and white mask. You'd have black where the mud was and white would be where the metal was. And I just find this just helps your metals just look really nice inside your game engine. So yeah, just going back real quickly on the exceptions to the rules. Turn that off. So like I said with the holes, we have got 100% roughness and 100% black in these holes. Now there are other ways to sort of treat this, but I find this is the easiest way just to get those looking quite nice. And I think with that is everything I wanted to speak to you about. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the live demo. Thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to go through some other parts of the scene today. So I just wanted to give similar to Justin, really. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro to myself, and then also talk about some of the projects that I've worked on, those kind of things. So let's get through this. Okay, so yeah, let me just make sure I've got the right screens and things up here. Sorry, I might just need to share. My notes have disappeared, so let me just fix that. Apologies. There we go. Cool. All right. So obviously I'm Ben Keeling, advanced environment artist. As Justin also said, you can find a link to my portfolio over at ArtStation. And I've been in the games industry exclusively. So Justin obviously mentioned some of the films that he worked on, but I've been a game artist for 8 years. I worked on lots of different projects. I worked on Need for Speed, VR projects, Halo, and Suicide Squad more recently. So those are my current projects I've worked on. And I'm going to show a little bit of the work that I produced as part of our collaboration. I wanted to start just by showing off a couple of personal projects, some of the things that I've done in the past, and then we'll jump into showing off some of the parts of the collaboration. So this scene I created actually for the ArtStation competition. I was doing a bit more foliage, mech work, and also trying to do some modular kits with trim sheets and that type of stuff for the competition, because it was quite a quick turnaround. So doing the trim sheets and those types of things obviously means that I can get the scene done a little bit faster. And also made a prop for tutorial with experience points, so showing a bit more of the high to low process from baking that Justin just touched on, and part of a slightly larger scene. So covered the asset itself and some of the storytelling elements and all of those elements that he just mentioned in his breakdown as well, trying to add little details and notes and small assets to try and tell a bit more of a story as well. And if I could just go forward one here. So I also worked recently on a road sweeper. This was done by a concept from Sean Mooney, and he made this really awesome looking road sweeper that looks very much like a cute, fun toy. So it was touching a little bit more on some of those exaggerated realism and more stylized approaches that we just touched on with Justin's presentation. I also did some more foliage with one of my other scenes as well here. And this is from the substance competition for the meat mat. So just working a little bit more on texturing, having a little bit more fun with texturing only workflows in substance and everything there for competitions. So as Justin already touched on, this is the project that we worked on together, the collaboration. And so with this, we wanted to try and create something fun. We had this idea of the robot sort of diorama scene, and with the theme of recycling. And we also, when we first started this, we had a very clear goal of trying to get animation into the project. We wanted to have the robot moving around and flying around the scene and different things animating, and lots of life and story to the project. That was part of what made it feel fun and exciting and engaging, and tell a story with the assets and the movement and everything as well. So that was the idea behind the scene. And here's some of the assets that I created. So I'm going to talk today a bit more about some of the trash elements. So on the left-hand side, you can see we've got the cubes, trash piles, trash objects, and then there's also tiling materials. So I wanted to touch on those, and I'll break that down in a second. But these were supposed to be in the scene themselves to tell the story that the trash had been collected through this big orange pipe and sucked into the machines, and then it gets recycled through the different machines that Justin had made. And so he had also piled up the trash cubes, very sort of, Wall-E-esque. That's the idea behind it a little bit. And also just to showcase the trash in the scene as well, some of the trash piles, and potentially that he's kind of clearing a pathway as he's moving around the space. And then that stuff gets sort of shipped off into different places. So that was the idea behind some of those assets. So for the stream today, I wanted to go through a bit of the asset creation side. So I'm going to touch on the assets that I created for the trash itself and show the Substance Painter workflows. And then I'm going to talk about the simulation tiling texture that I use. So I created the assets, and then because we wanted to have this idea of trash, I knew that I wanted to have various different assets that included individual props, tiling materials, trash piles, trash cubes. So there was obviously quite a heavy focus on trash in general. And so doing that, I knew that I needed various different trash objects and everything there. So that was definitely important for me to get that side of things across. So I'm just going to touch on that stuff. So I'm just going to, let me just briefly check chats and things here in case there's any questions I wanted to go through. But I think we're all good on the question side. So cool. So I'm going to start over here inside of Blender. So let me just pull that up. So for the models, not dissimilar to Justin, I had a approach which was high to low poly workflow for these. And the idea behind the trash objects themselves was I wanted to try and have some models that would have been naturally left behind on the beaches. So it's selling that sort of storytelling of recycling assets, people abandoning their rubbish on the beach, and then it getting disregarded and put into the sea, and then being sucked up in this diorama. That was the story I was trying to get across. And so I just researched lots of reference for different trash and looked at beaches full of rubbish and that type of thing. And so that gave me a good idea of the types of things that would be left behind in terms of the beach. So for this, I have a few of the objects that are more food items and those types of things. And then I've also got a couple of other bits like ropes and wood that I also created for the modular parts of the diorama, but these get put into the tiling texture later. So this is more like the collection of all the assets together, if you like. So for this, I started with a really simple workflow for just modeling the high poly for these assets. And I have colored textures on these so that when I do my bakes for my material IDs, I can get different materials. So I have one for the metal areas, one for plastic, one for different labeled areas. So this is so that I can easily mask out the different sections and apply different materials and things to these areas. And so with this is super simple workflow for these. I wanted to have some damage and sculpting and things, but because time was a bit tight on the project, I actually opted to not do that in ZBrush and do some of that stuff in Substance Painter procedurally. So I'll show that when I get into the Substance Painter part. So for the workflow is super simple. They're mostly just modifiers with subdivisions and things like that. So just simple geometry like polymodeling for these, and then I apply bevels and smooth everything out and get things looking nice. And I'm just working in the same kind of stylization. I'm keeping everything rounded and chunky and a little bit sort of more exaggerated than real life, but still focusing on the real life counterpart. So I'm definitely trying to get across what the object actually is, but still keeping more of a stylized look to it. So the idea behind these, so you can see that a lot of them have more chunkier sort of tactile pieces, and handles, like big chunky handles and rounded bevels and that type of stuff. So yeah, so that's for these guys. And then also similar to what Justin had touched on previously, I have got my assets set up with the underscore high for these ones, and then also the counterpart for the bake is the same. So you can see here I have the drinks can bottom, low. So when I do my baking, none of the normals everything is going to bake cleanly without any intersecting and transferring of detail from one section to the other. And I could just keep everything nice and clean. I used to do, in the past before the mesh name baking, I used to do exploded bakes. And then as the tools had improved and they introduced those new features, that's what I moved to doing the mesh name baking, which is obviously a lot better for that type of stuff. So yeah, and that's these guys. And then I have my bakes. I actually do more of a mid poly for these. So especially on the cylinders, you can see that the cylinders are pretty round. This is in the final game asset, like the low poly. I cut all the divisions out of those and optimize those. But for clean bakes on rounded things, if you have a more higher poly mesh, when you do your baking, you'll just get a lot cleaner bakes and you can cut out the divisions for cylinders and things later. So that's what I tend to do. And then you can add in, similar to what Justin said, you can add in cuts and break up the surfaces and shapes and things like that later. And you can see a little bit more of that as well with the actual assets, because I started to create sort of damaged versions. So I have the actual, say in this example, the bottle, and then I use some sort of deformation like FFDs and things like that to try to get different versions of these from the same asset. So that way I could create squished cans and squished bottles, and also had a thought about sort of peeling back cans and that type of stuff, just to give a little bit more interest and life to the assets. And then I can also use those in different ways when I'm placing them in the scene as well. I can actually place different versions of them as well from the same asset. So that covers the actual asset themselves. I'm going to go now over into Painter, and I want to showcase the workflow that I normally use for doing texturing. So the first thing, if I pull up, so I've got two texture sets here. One is for the labels that actually appear on the assets themselves. And then I have my other texture set here, which does the texturing of the main object. So we'll touch on the object part of this first, and then I'll go back to the labels, because the labels are pretty simple, but the trash objects show a bit more of that actual workflow. So I'm just going to, let me close some of these guys here so we can just see the things here a bit clearer. Cool. So yeah, so first off, if I just come over to the texture sets, I'm just going to isolate that so we can just look at the objects without any of the labels themselves. So what I'll always do in my projects when I'm working on an asset is I'll start with my bakes, get everything working how I want to. So I usually just use the Substance Painter to do the bakes using bake mesh maps. And so I can just reference my high poly and everything in here, and then I can run the bakes and get all the information that I need. And then when I'm happy with stuff, normally I'll check it by looking at the normals and the curve, like the ambient occlusion and the curvature are really good for checking that your bakes are doing what you expect them to do, and that they're nice and clean. And then you can also just put a smart material on things to check as well. And then once I'm happy and all the bakes are clean and I want to move forward with the texturing, the first things I'll do, the first setup I'll have a baseline material and the validate at the top. So similar to what Justin had already touched on, I've got the 50 RGB, 70 to 100%, and combined set here for the validate. And then I put a base material in there, or a base layer, that's just a fill layer basically. I've just renamed it. So I put that in there. And so the reason for that is because sometimes you'll see you get a checkerboard in certain channels. So it can be a little bit difficult to kind of see what's going on in the individual textures, because you end up with this checkerboard sort of situation. Whereas if we bring in the baseline material, you'll see that things are sort of filled out in the background. It's just a lot easier to read certain channels. You'll be able to understand what's going on in those. So that's normally the setup that I do. I do that for every project that I tend to work on, or every Substance Painter file that I set up. And then to start with, I actually put in my base materials. And these are just laid out as smart materials. Some of these are smart materials I've created previously. And then I would drop those in and I would mask those to the individual material. So here you can see I have a black plastic for those particular areas. I've got various different plastics and metals, and these are just being assigned to the different areas. At this stage, I'm focusing on good values for the base color and also variation. You can see, it might be difficult to see in the video, I don't know how well it comes across, but there's lots of color variety into these, just subtle information that can give a bit of life to the base color. And then the same for the roughness. Often I put grunges, dust and grime and a bit of interest in there that just tells a story, even at the base level sort of layer. So you can see there's a bit of rust and extra things. This is also going to have more storytelling as we bring in more layers, but it's just a good baseline to get everything in there. And so I also mentioned earlier I was going to touch a bit on the damage. So for this, I actually I wanted to try and do a little bit of an experimentation with doing the damage mostly in Substance Painter. And so on this see-through plastic, I actually have a section here for damage. So these guys, this is what it looked like in the bake. So you can see that everything is kind of clean. And then I bring in some deformation and things using height channels. So with this, I've just got grunges that I'm bringing in. So this one is just like an overall kind of grunge that comes in, and I can paint this in and out. I can also blur the effect as well. So I sort of softened up, just put a grunge in there with a sort of soft effect. And that just deforms the height map of the bottle, gives a little bit more interest to things. I have this one, which is actually more of an edge mask. So for this one, I created, if we just kind of come through and turn off some of the layers, I have an edge wear effect, and then I bring in a crystal node on the edges. So this is to sort of simulate a little bit more like a ZBrush pass, where I would have come in and just broken up the edges. I'm sort of blurring that, applying some slope blur, adding a grunge on top to just break it up and subtract some of the areas. And then also I can paint that out as well. So this is nice just for sort of knocking back some of the edges. And I'm just trying to simulate some of the workflows that I would go through if I was doing a damage pass over in ZBrush. So that's that. And then I also have another one. This one is just a crystal sort of breakup. Generally for plastic, I wanted to have that almost feel like it was crunched or scrunched up a little bit there with some of those types of details. So that's the idea there. Just wanted to briefly touch on the damage because I think it's a little bit more specific to what I was doing in this particular example. And then, so for the next stage, I also put in some labels. And these ones I did in the same way Justin had mentioned, where you basically drag in the alpha and then you can kind of move it around. But one difference I did do was I put I often put grunge maps into things like this. It's just a really nice way to add a little bit of breakup. You can see that it feels like the label is being peeled away a bit. So that can be really good for just adding more interest and variety there as well in the texturing. This section I actually add a bunch of paint splashes and just general pickup of things that could have been added in terms of the assets when they've been lying around on the beach, and just people dropping stuff on top of them, and it just getting a little bit more interest. And this one was also intended to add a little bit more color variety as well. I'm bringing in some teals and pinks and other things like that as well. Then I have a dirt pass. So this one is broken into a couple of different things. I have general sort of sand. This is coming from the bottom upwards on the asset. And that's supposed to be to bed it into the beach a bit more, because when it's being placed on the beach, the sand would sort of impact the asset. So I'm trying to give a bit more of that storytelling where these have been placed on the beach for a while and the sands kind of got caught up on the assets and everything. And then I have a sort of caked on or dried on dirt. And this is coming in as well as like a sort of old dirt, just trying to give a little bit more interest and storytelling as well there on that one. And then here I have the dust, a second kind of layer of dust. This one is just a bit more splashes, so maybe some dirt splashes and things have kind of made their way onto the asset. So for the labels, these are actually just planes that are placed on top. And for the texturing of these, I created the texture of the labels over in Photoshop. I actually painted out by hand some of those. So what happens here, it's why it's kind of simple, is we bring in the texture for that and the opacity for the labels. And then I actually add some alpha in there. So the alpha is breaking up the edges of that. You can see that it's sort of just giving a little bit of edge variety there. And then I add a few of the same effects that I had here. So I've got some of those splashes. I actually bring in the dust and dirt passes. These are actually done as instances. So when you have a layer, you can just right click on it and create an instance across the texture set. So if you do that, it's going to take that and apply it to the one that you select. And then that's an actual instance. And you can see that by the sort of icon here. So when you click on that, it will take you and show you where that instance actually lives. So I just did that for speed. It means that I don't have to try and bring in the same dirt and layers and everything. I can just instance them across for this particular case, and it blends it into the other sections there. Cool. So that kind of covers the asset side of things. So in terms of just like recapping here, we have just gone through the asset creation side with the Blender workflows and some of the Substance Painter stuff, which is the assets that we see here on the right. So high to low poly workflow, doing some damages and things in Substance Painter, texturing and everything, and bringing those assets back as their textured form. So yeah, that covers that side. So now I wanted to move on to the simulation material. So how do I go from these assets that we see here on the right to the tileable texture that we see on the left? And I wanted the tileable texture to, in the scene, blend the assets. You can actually see it here when we look on the sand. This is to blend the trash assets into the beach. So we paint the tileable texture, mix it together with the sand, and then we place those assets on top. And so that gives us, otherwise we would see sort of like the sand coming through the asset, so it wouldn't be as convincing. It's like blending. You often see that type of effect as well in games with sort of rubble. So if you have a rubble tileable material and then rubble assets, you can create something kind of similar. So it's a very similar approach, but for trash, beach trash rather than for rubble. So yeah, so for the simulation material, that starts live over in Blender. So I'm going to just bring up my other scene for that. And so I want to talk about, to start with, how this actually, this is a little bit like a sort of one I prepared earlier sort of situation. So in terms of the actual tileable texture, what I actually have here is I have a bunch of assets that have actually been simulated. And you can see that this is what makes up the tileable texture. So if I just hide this plane and I add in a new plane here, this one, if I just bring this back to the origin here, you can actually see that this is a 2-meter plane. So if we look at the top of this, you can see that this is where the assets are actually being collected, and then we have our placement here. So just to go through this, because I did a couple of things here that make life a lot easier. So if we just hide, let's hide these guys here, what you'll see just to start off with is we have this collection of assets. So when we're looking at this from a top-down view, you can see that at the moment none of these are intersecting the edges. This is just all the assets that are placed in the middle of the texture. We don't care about these. These are going to tile already because we only care about the edges and the corners to make a tiling material from this workflow. So what I do is I actually create the assets that are in the corners. I need to replicate into every single corner. So what I do here is I actually just array them, or you could offset them, duplicate them and offset them. If you're not using Blender, you can also do this in other 3D programs as well, in Max or Maya or whatever program you're using. So in this case, this is actually just offset by, you can see it's offset by 200 centimeters or 2 meters to appear in the corner. So I do that for any of the assets that are placed over 2 edges. So you can see here the bucket, it's placed over the left edge and also the top edge. So that means that we can get the corner to tile nicely. And then what I will do then is anything that is on, say, the top, I have a group and I place all the assets that are crossing over that boundary. You can also see some of them where the simulation has just run out. Some of these assets aren't actually needed. You could just remove these assets. So it's only the ones that are on the edge that we care about, but it's fine. I've put them into a folder or a collection. And I do that for the top and for the sides. And then to make this tile, I actually add a thing called a collection instance. So what this is it's an instance of a layer or collection. So if I bring in, say, the side here, this would be an instance of that group. And if we just zero it out back here, we can just offset that. And that's now going to make sure that it tiles, assuming we put this in the right place. So we could put that into 2 meters on the edge. It's just offsetting that. So that's actually what I do here. I have the side and the top, and then I have these collection instances that line up here. You can see that they're offset to create the tileable texture. The reason that this is good is because it's an instance. So if I was working on the texture, and this is actually what happened when I was doing it, was I wanted to move assets, say from, say they were crossing over the edge and I hadn't put them into the right folder, I could just move them into the folder and it's going to update here. So you can see that this is an exact copy if we move it back on top here. So so that's how you get the tileable part of it to work, because I think that's something that can be confusing for these types of textures in terms of simulation, and then how do you actually make it tile. That's the approach that I followed. And so next up, I guess, is more of the actual simulation side of it. Like, how do we actually get the simulation portion of this to actually work? So here you can see like the final kind of version of the texture where everything is like tiling and looking correct. But how do we actually run a simulation on something like that? So what I'll do is I'll just come back over to Blender here. So the first thing is that you need an object for things to actually collide on. So in the case of this, I actually have the plane that so if I bring this in, and we'll just hide the objects. So I have my plane, and then what I need to do is I need to create an asset that's going to be our spawner. So I would create, in this case, I created a cube. And you can scale the cube and manipulate the cube if you want to sort of, so this is going to be filled with objects. So the idea behind this is that we fill this with objects, and then we run the simulation, all the objects drop onto the ground, and then they collide with each other, which creates our tileable texture with no intersections. So the first thing is to create the asset. So I just created a box, created the cube, and then I need to add a particle emitter to that. So if you, in Blender, you just go to the particle properties, which is this dialog here, and you just click the plus, and that will bring us our options for particles. The first thing that we would do here is we need to choose the thing to actually use for the particle. So I select render as under the render option and just choose collection. And so the reason I'm doing this is because I actually have a collection here called check assets, which is all the assets I know I want to spawn. So these are, you can just see they're just the normal assets. I've separated them all out into individual assets, and I've got the pivots in reasonable locations in the center of the assets. So that's what the collection that we're going to choose. So we're going to come over into here, and we're going to choose instant collection, and we're going to choose check assets. At the moment, you still just see a cube. You don't see anything coming up. And so the first thing we want to do here is we want to go to viewport display and just turn the emitter off. And you'll see that now we don't see the cube. We just see a box, which is kind of like a ghost box with nothing in it, right? And so what we want to do here is we want to come over to, so if I come back over to layout, and what you'll see here is that we have our timeline on the bottom here for the asset. It's set to, the timeline set to 1 at the moment, but we have 250 frames for the timeline. So when you play the animation, you're going to go to frame 250. And in our particle system, you can see that when we run the simulation, it's actually going to end in frame 200. So I'm just going to set that to frame 1. And now you'll see that we have some assets, but they're really small. So if we jump back over to the modeling thing here, we can see our assets. I'm going to just come over to this, and under where it says scale, I'm going to set my scale to 1. And now we can see a bunch of these assets that are actually spawning on the cube. So this is the kind of first step in getting some success with spawning the particles. Everything is looking good. So the next thing is you can add some variety to this. You can come into random rotations and things. You can start playing around with this. So we just come to rotation, increase our randomize to 1. That's going to orientate these all randomly and different. You also do have some options in here as well. If we come over to our collection, you can see that it's inheriting the object scale. You can also get it to inherit the rotation. You can have it pick randomly. You can spawn other things as well. So you've got different options. You can also, under the count options, you can choose how to weight different assets. So if you wanted, for example, I don't know, 20 tinned food cans and only 1 glass, you can come in and actually set those options there as well if you wanted to specify things a bit more like that as well. So that's setting up some randomness. The other thing is that at the moment, this is all spawning on the object's faces. So what I'd like to do is have it spawn in the volume of the object. And the way that you do that is under the options here for, I'm just going to find it, I think it's under the source options. You can see here that it's emitting from face. What we actually want to do here is emit from volume. So when we do this, it should actually be inside the object. So you can hopefully see that there. It's now emitting from the volume. So now we've got something working. To run the simulation, you basically play the animation. But if I do that, I won't do it in this example because it might most probably crash. So I don't want to risk that. But you need to add rigid bodies to these, which is basically collision to the object, so things will collide with each other. And to do that, it's quite simple. You just come over into our options here. This one actually already has a rigid body, but if we remove it, you just click this button here. So this is actually the physics properties. You come over to rigid body. And for this one, we would set passive, which just means that it's not going to fall. It's going to stay where it is. And we can actually increase our friction. If we increase that to 1, when the objects land on it, they're not going to sort of slide around. They're going to stay put, which will help in terms of the actual assets and everything there. And so then for the physics, we actually need to convert these into objects and apply rigid bodies to them. So the way you do that is you search, which is F3, and then you do make instances real, which will convert all of the particles into actual assets. And then we can select the first one in the list and add a rigid body to that. And you can come in and set options. So we could increase the friction. Some of these guys, like the dampening and the rotation, this will also help increasing these guys. There is a tutorial I found on this that can help if you did want to set this type of thing up in Blender. I can maybe link that up as well after the session. But yeah, so that's how you set it up. Obviously, we only have that on the one asset. So to apply that, you want to select all of your assets. So I'll just hold Shift and select them. Come under rigid body and then just do copy from active. And this will apply the rigid bodies to all of the other objects that you have. So when you run your simulation now, everything should work. And let's assume, so if we come all the way back up to the top here, and what I'll do actually is I'll just delete these assets that I've just created. So let's assume that we've run the simulation. Then the next step would be to come in. So you'll have a pile of assets on the ground. The next step would then be to come on and actually set up those instances and make it tile. But if you're just working on this and you wanted to temporarily just get stuff going, you don't need to worry about tiling basically until you've got that side of it working. So you can just do some tests basically on that one. Cool. So I'm just going to start the chat because I think we had a question. So the question was, any tips for the normal skittish wobbly simulation collision problems? Yeah, so that is one of the problems I ran into sometimes with simulations, because you've got lots of things colliding. Stuff can just explode and fly into everywhere, and it's a bit crazy. And so the settings that I just talked about with so when we add the rigid body, when I was watching tutorials about this, the dampening and the rotation, messing about with those was what really gave me a good result where everything was colliding and not exploding. So these two were kind of like the key ones, and also the friction. I think the bounciness you can also play with. If you have the bounciness, that was also improving things. And the other experiment I did was with the collision type, because you have convex hull, which is basically a sort of cheap mesh surrounding the object, whereas you can actually use like either more simplified ones or you can even use more accurate ones. So depending on what you're trying to do, these can also be kind of helpful. But I think I had the most success maybe in the dampening and in the friction options there for running the simulation. I think as well you can also set masses, so sort of weight to the object. So if you know the rough weight, then if it's more heavy, then you're less likely for things to kind of hit the ground and go crazy and skittish, as you mentioned. So that is maybe also something to play around with. But yeah, most of the controls for these are going to live within the rigid body, because that's where you're setting its collision and how it's actually going to interact with other objects. So that's all of that stuff. So after we've got this, obviously we've got the high poly parts, we've got all of the pieces. How do we turn that into the texture? So the next stage for that is I just export so this is effectively like our high poly. We actually have our high poly assets there. And then I actually have a plane. So that would be the low poly, the 2 meter plane that I'm baking to. So I actually did all the baking over in Marmoset. And so you can see that I have that set up here. So I have a bake group, my project bake. I've got my high polys, all the assets that are actually contained and simulated there. And then I have my low poly, which is just the plane. So for the plane, this is extruded above all the assets. So when I do the baking, it's going to capture everything that we have here. And the only other noteworthy things are that I have the materials applied. So I've got, these are actually the textures that I created for the assets from Substance Painter that I showed earlier. So these ones, this is important. I'll show you once we get into Substance Designer why this is important later, but we have the normals and the albedo and roughness and everything in there. So those are all set up for the assets. And so because I have ropes and wood as well as some of the other kits that I made as well. So we've got other textures going on as well in this section. And then for the bakes, I bake a bunch of different things, normals, world space, height, curvature, AO, all of the individual textures. So the base color, roughness and metallic, and then some transparency and vertex colors. I think in the end I didn't use the vertex colors. I played around with that for colorizing and masking different areas if I wanted to sort of tweak individual assets, but in the end I didn't actually use that. So I think the vertex I left out.
Ben, I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
I was just wondering if you could explain the benefits of baking in Marmoset as opposed to directly in Substance Designer.
Yes, definitely. So one of the things that I found with Marmoset, there's a few different things. Marmoset has a slightly newer baking options than Substance Painter does. They have updated Substance Painter more recently with a few more maps that you could bake. So it used to be the case that the options you have for how many maps you can bake is greater than in Substance Painter. You can see the list of these is a lot more maps. And you never, in Substance, you can't bake the individual materials. Like if you wanted to bake the base color from an asset onto something else, that's not something that you can do as far as I'm aware in Substance Painter. You can, I think, in Designer, like Designer has a few more baking options, but Painter is a little bit more limited. And then the other thing that's really good is you've also got, it's a lot faster, so you can bake the normal map almost immediately, which is really good. And it has skew maps, which are also really helpful, and a cage that you can paint on live in the viewport. So it's a little bit more interactive in Marmoset because you're obviously working in a viewport with your assets, understanding what's happening, seeing it more in real time. Whereas in Substance Painter, when you hit the bake button, you see the textures rendered like a sort of, like pre-rendered or something, but it's not, you're not seeing the assets, you're not able to adjust the cages in real time. So yeah, you have a few more options available in Marmoset. And the reason I use Marmoset in this particular example is because I wanted to bake out the color maps. So that was the reason I had Marmoset as opposed to using Painter.
Thank you.
Sweet. So let me now just round up by talking about the material. So this is we're inside a Substance Designer, so jump over to Designer here. And what you'll see here, if I run through these particular parts, is I've actually got the baked textures that I spat out of Marmoset. So we'll just go briefly over those, and then I'll talk about how I combine them to make the texture for the tiling material. So I have the base color. This one is baked from the base color of the Substance Painter asset, so you can actually see it's all the textures that we just showcased there. We have our normals, we have our roughness. This one is our metallic mask, and then I have a height map, and then I have my ambient occlusion, world space normals, curvature, and then I also have the opacity like alpha mask. So this is white where the objects are and black where the plane is. So you'll see this is a mask basically for where objects don't appear or do appear depending on which way around the mask is. So those are all the bakes, and then what I did to start with is I bring all of those bakes in, and I do make a couple of adjustments to things to get these a bit more in range of where I want them. So the first one is with the base color. I actually apply a background color to this so things start to blend a bit clearer, and I also make a base color adjustment to brighten up the albedo slightly there. And then for the height map, I run auto levels because this one I don't have a whole lot of range actually in the height map. So I think I could probably have adjusted the bake in Marmoset a little bit, but just in terms of this one, I just run auto levels and then blur this slightly because the height map is pretty sharp. So that's for the height map side of things. For this one, this is just the mask, so I basically just invert this and apply some blurring and things to soften it. So I think that's most of the adjustments in terms of just getting stuff working, and you can see that this is the texture that we're getting out of there. So then the next step here is I combine this with some regular Substance Design workflow. So I bring in a tileable texture to fill out the spaces because I want this to feel like a beach trash. So I take my objects and I actually fill in the background using that mask. So I'm using the material blend node, which actually just blends all my channels together. So we've got our sand texture, like tileable sand texture, with the bakes that we've done here. And then I combine that based on the alpha texture. So we get our sand appearing in the background areas. Then I apply this. This one is actually just a dirt. So this one helps to, so we're using the AO bake and the curvature there to create a mask for the dirt. So this is hopefully to give a little bit more of the sand kind of creeping up onto the edges. We could actually adjust this as well if we want to increase the amount of sand dirt that we actually see here. We could increase like more grunge as well if we want sand to kind of come into the texture more. You can kind of see how that works by creating that mask. So we're able to sort of blend things together a little bit more. And so then from there, I do a little bit of individual channel adjustment. This one I applied a curvature on top. So sometimes with assets and textures, I'll put curvatures on a lower opacity over the top of things. It helps to just give a bit more definition in the textures. And then I also apply this handy filter called the PVR filter, which is I think it's I want to say this is maybe it's Vincent. I was going to say it was maybe a Daniel Theiger one, but it's actually Vincent. This just applies like random colorization. So you just go from this to just like random color. It's a really nice node for adding more variety into the base color. So I did that. And then here we have some adjustment to the heights. So for the height map, because things are kind of sharp, what I actually do here is I blend my sand into the height more. So I use non-uniform blur and then I apply the sand in. So when I'm doing this, it's just going to smooth out the height maps a little bit more. So we just don't have as much like sharpness in the height map, because otherwise, I mean, you can see actually if I just bring this in as an example with the height. So the height map there, you can see that it's like, actually that's the blurred version. So if I just go to the version where it's a little bit sharper, you can see there's some stretching on there. So as we bring in the sand, we can actually smooth out. I'm effectively just kind of smoothing out the areas for the height map. We're not really using the height map too much in the final result here. So when we bring the texture together, we're not really got that much height map information. It's like more subtle. And then you can see here, if we bring the final texture together, this is what we're looking at here with all of the assets and everything, which is similar to what we see here. So yeah, so just to recap, obviously we went through the asset side of things, which is the image here. And then we've gone through the simulation. So we went through the Blender side of that, how to actually get simulations set up and working, how to make things tile, how to bake it all out, how to then finish off the different elements over in Substance Designer itself as well. That's for the finished texture. And so also just to briefly touch on the cubes, these guys, originally I had planned to use the tiling texture as the base for the cube. But one of the things that I found was I wanted these to feel like they were crushed by the machine that Justin had made in the scene. And when I applied this, obviously those objects are all kind of modeled whole objects. So it just looked a bit weird when I applied the tileable texture to those cubes. So what I actually did was run another simulation where I put the assets into a box and actually crushed them in the box. And then once I had the crushed versions, I baked those onto a cube. And to finish that off, I applied a couple of different assets that I actually had crushed down, which gives a little bit more of the silhouette breakup onto the actual objects and everything there. So so that kind of brings everything together. For the other assets that I didn't cover the piles. These ones are actually just the tileable texture applied to a a kind of heaped pile, and then I actually simulated the assets falling onto the top of that pile, and then low polyed those more, and that's actually our assets that we created. So you can see they're a little bit more of a pile. These were great for just populating out the beach, as I said, in different places and giving the illusion that there was more trash in the scene. So I think there was also another question. So the question was, did you bake the normal map from the low poly texture meshes to this as well? If so, any issues with color space, flipped screen channel, any of that? So the normal maps from so I would have baked the normal maps from the assets. I'm going to actually have a check to see if how well that comes across over in the normals that we have here. Yeah, so because if you look at the wood, you can see that the wood and also the rope, they have normal maps here, which are baked from, that's a sculpt rather than a high poly piece of wood. That's like the ZBrush sculpt, and then the normals apply to it. So if we jump back over into Marmoset, you can see that these are like the low poly wood with the texture and the normals and everything. You can see if we click on this. I had no problems with that baking. I think what I would have done, so let me check in the normals themselves if I changed any of these. So I would maybe have, so I have flip Y turned on in terms of the normal settings, but then the other thing that also can sometimes mess with stuff is the tangent space in the project itself. So what you can do is if you're having problems, like depending on which package you export from, you can switch. But you can leave it as at Marmoset here, and then just if you flip it in terms of this stuff, like flip Y here will obviously flip the green channel. So if you have things the wrong way around, you can just enable this in the settings. So just click the cog and turn this on and off, and that should fix any issues that you have if things are the wrong way around. But no, I didn't have. That's what got spat out in terms of designer. This is the baked texture, and you can see the normals coming through in these areas. So yeah, that was, in terms of the normals, that was all good for me. I didn't have any problems with the normal maps side of it. So hopefully that answers that question. Cool. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover in terms of the live stream. So thank you guys for watching and going through everything and questions and everything there. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben Keeling and Justin Walker, for taking the time to share this amazing workshop for us at Beyond Extend. Make sure to check out their amazing work in the description below. We also want to throw out a big thank you to all our Patreon supporters. These workshops are only possible because of your support. If you want to be there live for the next one, head on over to beyondextend.com, where you can find access to our community, environment art resources, and other items to help you grow as an environment artist. Stay creative and see you there.